Speaker, and let me start in a positive vein by welcoming the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday of an acceleration of the phasing out of new petrol and diesel vehicles. Of course, he still lags still some way behind the Scottish Government's target of 2032 by a good few years, of course, but it is progress, and we welcome it nonetheless. The Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Michael Matheson, today set out Scotland's National Transport Strategy. It's an ambitious and bold strategy that places decarbonisation and our net zero targets at the heart of all the Scottish Government does. It also places active travel at the top of the transport hierarchy, where it should be. The benefits to our transport system and the environment are manifold, but the wider benefits are in many ways greater still. Diseases of inactivity are amongst the biggest killers in Western society. Placing walking at the centre of any transport strategy boosts life expectancy and allows our NHS to spend resources and time elsewhere. So the debate we're having today is not just about the environmental benefits for all, it's about the environment each of us lives in and how we can improve it to give everyone the best outcome possible from their life. And it is a strategy, something missing from the UK Government approach. There is no national transport strategy for England or the UK as a whole. There are investment strategies, inclusive strategies, strategic plans for the north of England, infrastructure skills strategies, all important, all part of the mix, but no overall plan to improve transport in the round. So my colleague at Holyrood deserves praise for the work he and Transport Scotland have done to embed principles of fairness, environmental justice, sustainable growth, tackling inequalities and transitioning to net zero in a national plan of action. To achieve those net zero targets, we need a strong lead from the state with clear-headed policies. We need that not just in terms of our obligations to cut emissions and tackle climate change, but also in developing our economy and society more generally. Gone are the days when millions of us lived within a short walk of our workplaces and neighbourhood shops. We now need and expect to be able to travel with the minimum of fuss and the maximum of comfort. And that's exactly how it should be in a wealthy 21st century society. But that sort of system cannot focus on one solution alone. We need a basket of policies that fit all our lives and takes our varying geography and topography into account. But we can look at what we know works and what can be done now and in the near future to accelerate sustainability. For example, improving our buses, as has been mentioned already by both front benches. In Scotland, nearly 400 million bus journeys are made every year, which is 4 times the number of ScotRail passenger journeys, and over a quarter of all people use a bus at least once a week. Nearly 1/5 of our school students travel to school on a bus. 4,000 buses result in over 1 million journeys every day, the length and breadth of Scotland from Shetland to Stranraer. But for far too long, the public bus system has been overshadowed by rail. Barely a week goes by without some breathless coverage of an incident on our railways, often merited, sometimes not so much. Meanwhile, the slow decline of bus services and the drift downwards of patronage and coverage largely goes unreported or commented on. This is exactly why the Scottish Government's programme for government announced last September a record £500 million investment in infrastructure designed to improve bus services by reducing and removing the impacts of congestion, more priority given to buses, and fundamentally increase buses' modal share and reduce our use of private cars. That modal share slipped below 10% for the first time in the last round of transport statistics. Just one reason why that £500 million represents a massively positive breakthrough in the priorities of transport. Investing in the bus network is not just about reducing emissions, congestion or moving to decarbonisation. It's also about social justice. Quite simply, the lower your income, the more likely you are to rely on the bus. We know that social mobility is not just a figure of speech. Flexibility of transport goes hand in hand with ease of access to employment and improves labour market options for employees. Supporting bus travel is a fully progressive policy that shifts wealth and income to the poorest in society and empowers people to have a much wider choice of where and how they want to earn a living. Now, I welcome the Government's announcement of some extra funding to reinstate some of the slash and burn policies instituted by Beeching nearly 60 years ago. My concern with the reversing Beeching programme is this. How do a series of separate branch lines scattered around the country form part of a system-wide plan for the rail network that looks at the bigger picture at a regional and national level? Now, whatever people's opinions of HS2, it's at least an attempt to think strategically about transport needs in the future. And I know he'll disagree with me on this, as he has previously, but the £500 million being called a drop in the ocean is the truth. The Borders Railway, which was a strategic project aimed at massively boosting connectivity and the economy of a part of the world too often left to fend for crumbs from the table, and which was one of the final victims of the Beeching Report in 1969, cost £294 million for 40 miles of single-line track, over 31 miles of length. With CPI inflation factored in, that is £328 million. By the time the consultants, the press officers and high-vis and hard hats for visiting dignitaries and, dare I say, visiting secretaries of state have been paid for, the £500 million promised by the DfT will pay for about 1.5 Borders railways somewhere in England. 60 miles of track added to a network of over 16,000 miles in England and Wales, an increase of 0.38%. And then that will give way.
He's making a very important point here, and I'm very grateful to him for giving way, equating the budget for HS2, and we're talking about 100 billion. And if you look at the Barclay dissenting report, it says the cost-benefit ratio is 60 pence for every pound spent. So the British government are about to burn £40 billion. Wouldn't it be better to chuck that 100 billion into the Beeching reversal fund, because that will do far more for connectivity than HS2?
Well, I certainly agree with him that the money that's been provided or promised thus far is insignificant in reality. I think Transport for the North put it best when they said it's around £70 billion that's required just to increase connectivity to the requisite level in the north of England, let alone the rest of the country. So £500 million is, I would say, a good start, is probably the best I could say about it. I'll give way briefly, but I'm conscious of Madam Deputy Speaker's urgings about time. So.
Okay, I thank him for giving way. And just on that £500 million, I've just got a response to that question. But the government's confirmed this is not new money in terms of the Department for Transport spending. It's actually money that's then clearly came from somewhere else. So it's another Tory contract, and does agree with that? And it should actually be real new investment that's coming forward.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, but I'm hardly surprised by the outcome or the response to his written question either. It's not unusual for this government to double count money and re-announce the same figures. But I do welcome the reopenings if they occur. My concern is that they simply don't go far enough in creating an integrated network of the type Beeching was happy to destroy. In 20 years of devolution, successive Scottish governments, both SNP and Labour-led, to be fair, have understood the importance of bold action to reverse the cuts made in a previous era. Airdrie-Bathgate, Larkhall, the Borders Railway, Stirling to Alloa, the Maryhill line extended, all reinstatements of Beeching closures, and the biggest programme of electrification and decarbonisation of the rail network in 40 years, with all services between our two biggest cities running under the wires, as well as Stirling, Alloa, Falkirk, Paisley Canal and Whifflet, with much more in the pipeline as part of the rolling programme of electrification. The result of all of this and much more will be a carbon-free rail system that helps Scotland achieve net zero. And I do hope the UK Secretary of State will visit the Cabinet Secretary for Transport in Edinburgh during his tenure to hear how it's done, and he can see the real investment going into Scotland's railways day in and day out. Now, these are not magic fixes or changes beyond our economic capacity. They're realistic, achievable solutions to the challenges we all face. Excuse me. Many of our roads are at or are over, in some cases, capacity, bringing with it increased congestion and resultant increased emissions. There are those who say we should stop building roads altogether. I say tell that to the residents of Aberdeenshire who have seen their travel transformed by the western peripheral route, or those crossing the Forth on the replacement crossing, which has seen not one day of closure due to high winds. A bridge built, I have to say, in the face of opposition of many who are now curiously quiet about the lack of support, or the residents of Dalry who, thanks to the newly opened bypass completed 7 months ahead of schedule, have seen traffic and pollution in their town plummet. Targeted investment in our road network, combined with the massive expansion in electric charge points and projects such as the electric highway along the A9, are all part of the mix in reducing emissions. Private transport must be available to as wide a cohort of society as possible. That's why Scottish households can now access grant funding that will, on average, pay for 80% of the cost of installing a home charge point, 30% more than the rest of the UK. There are more public charging points in Scotland per head than anywhere else outside London. We are rolling out support for e-bikes and for social landlords who want to develop zero-emission infrastructure and car clubs. And the low-carbon transport loan means more households than ever are in a position to make the switch now rather than later. And with used electric cars now becoming eligible, the choice available is getting wider all the time. Scotland is doing well, but Norway is soaring ahead in electric car deployment. By the end of 2020, half of all new cars sold will be electric. The result of bold policies and a determination by government to tackle a societal and environmental challenge. These bold policies are only possible because Norway has the resources and the power of an independent state to make those changes. If the UK doesn't want to use the powers it has to make that change, it should make sure Scotland does. Scotland has shown global leadership by being the first country to include international aviation and shipping emissions in its statutory climate targets. Now, I think it has already been addressed. Aviation is undoubtedly the most difficult sector to decarbonise, although I also welcome the industry's recently announced commitment to do so by 2050. Indeed, the SNP is already committed to decarbonise flights within Scotland by 2040 and aim to have the world's first zero-emission aviation region in partnership with Highlands and Islands airports. But let me conclude on this, Madam Deputy Speaker. Too often, transport policy appears, unfortunately, to be a contradiction in terms. In the short time since taking up my position as SNP transport spokesperson, I have been genuinely surprised at the lack of joined-up thinking that seems to pervade so much of what is sketched out for the future. Placing the zero-emission society at the heart of transport planning and wider government policy means joining up some of that thinking towards a common goal and a common strategy. That's exactly what the Scottish Government have been doing and are continuing to do, and that's what my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, will be doing tomorrow when he unveils the Scottish Budget. It's what the Cabinet Secretary for Transport did earlier this afternoon at Holyrood, and I hope it's what the UK Transport Secretary will begin to do as he reflects on this debate in the weeks and months ahead.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you. And, Madam Deputy